Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, by Daniel H. Pink. Comprehensive Summary. Introduction. Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us by Daniel H. Pink challenges conventional wisdom about human motivation, arguing that the carrot-and-stick approach of external rewards and punishments, what Pink calls Motivation 2.0, fails to effectively engage people in today's creative, conceptual work environments. Drawing on 4 decades of scientific research in behavioral psychology and economics, Pink demonstrates that our understanding of motivation has been largely misguided, particularly in business, education, and parenting. He argues that for routine, algorithmic tasks, traditional rewards may still be effective, but for the heuristic, creative challenges that increasingly dominate modern work, an intrinsic motivation system, which he terms Motivation 3.0, based on autonomy, mastery, and purpose produces dramatically better results. Pink contends that this mismatch between what science knows and what business does represents not just a theoretical concern, but a practical crisis leading to disengagement, diminished performance, and unfulfilled human potential across organizations and institutions. For readers seeking to understand why traditional motivational approaches often fail and how to create environments that truly engage human potential, Drive provides both a conceptual framework for understanding motivation and practical application for transforming how we organize work, education, and personal development. The book ultimately presents a vision of motivation that aligns organizational objectives with fundamental human needs, creating sustainable engagement that external incentives alone cannot achieve. Overview of the book. Pink structures his work around 3 key elements: a critical examination of prevailing motivational approaches, an introduction to a new motivational framework, and practical implementation guidance. The book begins by exploring the historical evolution of motivation theory, from early biological drives, Motivation 1.0, through the reward and punishment paradigm of scientific management, Motivation 2.0, revealing how these models increasingly fail to address contemporary work challenges. Pink then introduces 7 significant flaws in the reward-centered approach, examining how extrinsic motivators often undermine performance, creativity, and ethical behavior, what he terms the 7 deadly flaws. The central portion presents his alternative model, Motivation 3.0, built on 3 essential elements: autonomy, the desire to direct our own lives; mastery, the urge to make progress and get better at something that matters; and purpose, the yearning to do what we do in service of something larger than ourselves. For each element, Pink explores both the scientific foundation and practical manifestations across various contexts. The final sections provide specific implementation approaches for individuals, organizations, and parents, including concrete techniques for evolving motivation systems without creating organizational disruption. Throughout these sections, Pink balances scientific research with engaging case studies and practical examples, making complex motivational concepts accessible and immediately applicable. The book concludes with a comprehensive toolkit of exercises, discussion questions, and reading recommendations that support readers in applying the concepts to their specific circumstances, creating a work that functions as both theoretical exploration and practical handbook for motivation transformation. Key concepts and drive. The inadequacy of Motivation 2.0. Why carrots and sticks don't work. Pink begins by examining the dominant motivational paradigm in business, education, and parenting. The reward and punishment system he calls Motivation 2.0. Drawing on research by psychologists Edward Deci, Richard Ryan, and others, he demonstrates how this extrinsic motivation approach emerged from industrial-era assumptions about work that are increasingly misaligned with contemporary challenges. Pink identifies 7 fundamental flaws in the carrot-and-stick approach. Extrinsic rewards can extinguish intrinsic motivation, the undermining effect, can diminish performance, can crush creativity, can crowd out good behavior, can encourage cheating, shortcuts, and unethical behavior, can become addictive, and can foster short-term thinking. Through studies across diverse fields and contexts, Pink shows how rewards often produce the opposite of their intended effects, particularly for tasks requiring conceptual, creative thinking. He examines how contingent rewards, if-then incentives that promise rewards for specific behaviors or achievements, narrow focus, reduce risk-taking, and inhibit the lateral thinking essential for innovation. Pink distinguishes between algorithmic tasks, following established procedures to reach a single solution, where external rewards may still function adequately, and heuristic tasks, creative problem-solving without established procedures, where intrinsic motivation becomes critical. Throughout this analysis, Pink emphasizes that the science has been clear for decades, while practice has remained largely unchanged, creating a dangerous mismatch between what science knows and what business does, with significant consequences for organizational performance and human fulfillment. This critique establishes the foundation for his alternative motivational framework by demonstrating why traditional approaches increasingly fail in contemporary environments demanding creativity, engagement, and conceptual thinking. Type 1 and Type X, two contrasting motivational outlooks. Pink introduces the concept of motivational types to distinguish between fundamentally different approaches to work and life. He defines Type X behavior as focused primarily on extrinsic rewards, the external validation, compensation, and recognition that come from achievement, while Type 1 behavior draws energy from intrinsic motivators like the inherent satisfaction of the activity itself. Pink emphasizes that these represent not fixed personality types, but behavioral patterns that environments either encourage or suppress. Drawing on research by psychologists Carol Dweck, Teresa Amabile, and others, he demonstrates how these orientations affect performance, persistence, and well-being. Type 1 behavior, fueled by intrinsic motivators, correlates with greater physical and mental health, higher self-esteem, better relationships, and more sustainable high performance over time. Pink challenges the myth that intrinsic motivation lacks practical value, demonstrating how Type 1 behavior outperforms Type X in the long term, even by traditional metrics like productivity and profitability. He addresses the role of compensation, emphasizing that Type 1 individuals still care about money, but primarily as a threshold issue, fair compensation, rather than the primary driver of behavior. Once fairness concerns are addressed, intrinsic factors become the stronger motivational forces. Pink examines how organizational contexts either support or undermine Type 1 development, arguing that command and control structures, surveillance systems, and contingent reward schemes actively suppress intrinsic motivation regardless of individual predispositions. Throughout this discussion, Pink emphasizes that while people may naturally vary in their tendencies toward extrinsic or intrinsic motivation, environments play the decisive role in which pattern dominates, giving leaders, educators, and parents significant influence over motivational development. This framework creates the foundation for understanding the three elements of intrinsic motivation that follow: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, the desire to direct our own lives. Pink explores autonomy, the urge to direct our own lives, as the first essential element of intrinsic motivation. Drawing on self-determination theory and research across multiple fields, he demonstrates how autonomy, perceived choice and self-direction, creates engagement while its absence produces compliance at best and resistance at worst. Pink identifies four key dimensions of autonomy: task, what people do; time, when they do it; technique, how they do it; and team, who they do it with. For each dimension, he provides examples of organizations that have successfully implemented autonomy supportive practices, from results-only work environments, ROWs, that eliminate time control to Google's 20% time, that provides task autonomy for self-directed projects. Pink addresses common misconceptions about autonomy, distinguishing it from independence, working in isolation, and emphasizing how structure and autonomy can coexist through clear goals and accountability for results rather than processes. He examines how autonomy functions across different organizational contexts, from software development companies using agile methodologies to manufacturing environments implementing self-managing production teams. Pink provides specific guidance for increasing autonomy gradually without organizational disruption, including autonomy audits to identify control points. Now that rewards, unexpected after the fact recognition, that don't undermine autonomy like contingent, if then, rewards and non-controlling language that offers choice rather than demands compliance. Throughout this discussion, Pink emphasizes that autonomy represents not an organizational luxury, but a fundamental human need essential for engagement, particularly for creative, complex work requiring discretionary effort beyond mere compliance. This autonomy element creates the foundation for sustainable motivation by addressing the human need for self-determination that traditional management approaches often suppress in the name of control and standardization. Mastery, the urge to get better at something that matters. Pink examines mastery, the desire to improve in areas we value, as the second essential element of intrinsic motivation. Drawing on research by psychologists Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Anders Ericsson, and Carol Dweck, he demonstrates how the pursuit of improvement and excellence creates powerful engagement independent of external rewards. Pink identifies three key characteristics of mastery. It requires embracing a growth mindset, believing abilities can be developed through effort rather than being fixed traits. It demands deliberate, often uncomfortable practice rather than mere repetition, and it represents an asymptotic goal, always approachable but never fully reached, creating a sustainable source of challenge. He explores the concept of flow, the optimal psychological state where challenge and skill align perfectly, creating complete absorption in an activity, as the pathway toward mastery, explaining how this state simultaneously delivers high performance and deep satisfaction. Pink addresses common barriers to mastery, including performance goals that focus on looking good rather than improving, organizational contexts that emphasize compliance over development, and a natural human tendency to seek comfort rather than the productive discomfort that growth requires. He provides specific approaches for fostering mastery, including designing work around Goldilocks tasks that balance challenge and ability, creating feedback systems that focus on information rather than evaluation, emphasizing learning goals over performance goals, and breaking development into manageable chunks that create clear progress markers. Throughout this discussion, Pink emphasizes that mastery functions as a renewable motivational resource. Unlike extrinsic rewards that require constant escalation to maintain effectiveness, the satisfaction of improvement and competence development creates sustainable engagement through the inherent human desire for growth. This mastery element addresses fundamental psychological needs for competence and achievement that compensation alone cannot satisfy, explaining why people voluntarily devote thousands of hours to developing skills without external rewards. Purpose, the yearning to do what we do in service of something larger. Pink explores purpose, connecting to causes larger than oneself, as the third essential element of intrinsic motivation and perhaps the most powerful for sustainable engagement. Drawing on research from positive psychology, organizational behavior, and economic development, he demonstrates how purpose transforms performance by providing meaning beyond material self-interest. Pink examines how purpose manifests at three levels: purpose and goals, the why behind specific objectives; purpose in words, how organizations and individuals articulate their reason for existence; and purpose in policies, how operational systems either support or undermine larger meanings. He addresses the growing purpose mismatch in many organizations, the gap between what people seek, meaningful contribution, and what most business contexts provide, profit focus alone. Pink challenges the traditional separation between profit and purpose, presenting research and case studies demonstrating that purpose-driven organizations often outperform profit-maximizing counterparts on conventional metrics, including revenue growth, customer loyalty, and talent retention. He provides specific approaches for purpose integration, including connecting daily tasks to ultimate impact, creating policies that allow employees to directly engage with beneficiaries of their work, offering autonomy for purpose expression through self-directed projects, and developing metrics that measure purpose-related outcomes alongside financial results. Throughout this discussion, Pink emphasizes that purpose represents not merely an inspirational ideal but a practical necessity as younger generations increasingly prioritize meaning in career decisions and routine tasks become automated, leaving humans to focus on work requiring creativity, problem-solving, and human connection. This purpose element addresses the fundamental human need for transcendence and contribution that traditional motivation approaches often neglect, explaining why people consistently choose meaningful work over higher compensation when basic financial needs are met. Flow states, the psychology of optimal experience. Pink explores flow, the psychological state of complete immersion in an optimally challenging activity, as the experiential manifestation of intrinsic motivation. Drawing on Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's extensive research, he demonstrates how flow states simultaneously produce peak performance and deep enjoyment, creating what Csikszentmihalyi calls optimal experience. Pink identifies the essential conditions for flow: clear goals with immediate feedback, balance between challenge and skill level, merger of action and awareness where self-consciousness disappears, and concentration so intense that awareness of time and other concerns vanish. He examines how these conditions align perfectly with autonomy, self-direction, mastery, optimal challenge, and purpose, meaningful goals, making flow the psychological state that emerges when his motivational framework functions effectively. Pink addresses organizational barriers to flow, including fragmented attention through constant interruptions, arbitrary deadlines disconnected from work requirements, and micromanagement that prevents the autonomy flow requires. He provides specific approaches for fostering flow states, including creating distraction-free periods for focused work, designing tasks with clear goals and feedback loops, matching challenges to skills through appropriate task assignment, and establishing protected environments where flow-producing deep work can occur. Throughout this discussion, Pink emphasizes that flow represents both the psychological reward that sustains intrinsic motivation and the state of peak performance organizations seek, creating the rare alignment where optimal human experience coincides with optimal productivity. This flow concept provides the experiential understanding of how Pink's motivation framework feels in practice, explaining why the autonomy mastery purpose triad creates engagement that external incentives cannot match regardless of their magnitude. Type 1 for organizations. Transforming workplaces. Pink provides specific guidance for implementing Motivation 3.0 principles in organizational contexts, recognizing that transforming established motivation systems requires both conceptual understanding and practical approaches that acknowledge organizational realities. He presents a gradual implementation framework that begins with creating baseline autonomy through choice expansion in specific domains, time, task, technique, or team, while maintaining clear accountability for outcomes. Pink addresses compensation questions directly, recommending fair and transparent baseline pay, high enough to remove money as a central concern, supplemented by non-contingent recognition rather than if-then performance bonuses. He explores specific organizational practices aligned with intrinsic motivation, peer-to-peer rewards that recognize contribution without managerial control, open feedback systems that provide information for mastery development rather than evaluation, purpose integration through direct contact with beneficiaries, results focus that emphasizes outcomes while providing process autonomy, and collaborative goal setting that balances organizational needs with individual aspirations. Pink examines how various companies, from traditional corporations to emerging enterprises, have successfully implemented these approaches, demonstrating that intrinsic motivation principles apply across industries and organizational types rather than being limited to creative or technology sectors. Throughout this discussion, Pink balances aspiration with pragmatism, acknowledging that organizational transformation occurs incrementally rather than overnight, while providing specific starting points that create momentum without requiring complete system overhaul. This organizational implementation guidance transforms theoretical concepts into practical approaches, addressing the crucial question of how leaders can begin shifting motivation systems without creating disruption or requiring unrealistic organizational change. Type 1 for education. Rethinking learning motivation. Pink applies his motivation framework to educational contexts, examining how traditional educational approaches based on standardized testing, grades, and credential pursuit often undermine the intrinsic motivation essential for genuine learning. Drawing on research in educational psychology and classroom studies, he demonstrates how extrinsic motivators in education create many of the same problems seen in organizational contexts. Narrow focus on assessment targets rather than conceptual understanding, diminished creativity and risk-taking, reduced long-term interest in subject matter, and cheating behaviors when outcomes are prioritized over learning processes. Pink explores alternative approaches aligned with autonomy, mastery, and purpose, self-directed learning periods where students pursue topics of personal interest, mastery-based progression that allows variable time to reach competence rather than fixed time with variable learning, feedback systems emphasizing improvement rather than comparative evaluation, learning connected to authentic purposes beyond credential acquisition, and classroom environments that balance structure with choice. He addresses common concerns about intrinsic motivation in education, including the argument that not all learning activities can be inherently interesting, recognizing the reality while demonstrating how context and framing significantly influence interest, worries about preparation for real-world credential requirements, and implementation challenges within standardized systems. Throughout this discussion, Pink emphasizes that educational motivation affects not just academic achievement, but lifelong learning orientation, creating either curious, self-directed learners or credential-focused performers whose learning terminates when external requirements end. This educational application demonstrates how motivation principles transcend organizational boundaries, explaining why similar patterns appear across contexts where human engagement and development are central rather than being limited to specific domains or age groups. Type 1 for parents and families. Fostering intrinsic motivation. Pink concludes with examining how parents and families can apply intrinsic motivation principles to child development, recognizing that early experiences significantly shape motivational patterns that persist into adulthood. Drawing on research in developmental psychology and family studies, he demonstrates how common parenting approaches often unintentionally undermine intrinsic motivation. Excessive use of rewards and punishments for behavior management, praise focused on innate traits, "you're so smart," rather than effort and process, and controlling language that emphasizes compliance rather than autonomy supportive communication that offers rationales and choices. Pink provides specific guidance for developing Type 1 children, emphasizing learning goals over performance outcomes, praising effort, strategy, and progress rather than fixed ability, creating appropriate choice opportunities while maintaining necessary boundaries, connecting activities to meaningful purposes beyond compliance or reward, providing unconditional support independent of achievement, modeling intrinsic motivation through parents' own engagement with activities they genuinely enjoy, and gradually expanding autonomy as children demonstrate responsibility. He addresses common parental concerns, including worries about preparation for achievement-oriented educational and professional environments, balancing structure with freedom and navigating peer and cultural influences that emphasize extrinsic markers of success. Throughout this discussion, Pink emphasizes that motivation patterns established in childhood create foundations for adult approach to work, learning, and life satisfaction, making family environments perhaps the most significant context for developing the intrinsic motivation orientation that supports both achievement and fulfillment. This parenting application completes the book's comprehensive examination of how motivation principles apply across the full spectrum of human development and activity contexts. Conclusion: Drive offers a paradigm-shifting perspective on human motivation that challenges conventional wisdom while providing practical alternatives. By demonstrating the limitations of reward-centered motivation systems and presenting the science behind autonomy, mastery, and purpose as more powerful motivators for contemporary work and life, Pink provides both theoretical understanding and actionable approaches for transformation. The book's particular value lies in its integration of scientific research with practical application, moving beyond critique to provide specific, implementable strategies for individuals, organizations, educators, and parents. For readers seeking to understand why traditional motivation approaches often fail, and how to create environments that genuinely engage human potential. Drive offers a comprehensive framework that aligns performance with fundamental human needs and aspirations. By presenting intrinsic motivation not merely as a philosophical ideal, but as a practical performance enhancer, Pink creates a compelling case for transformation that appeals to both humanitarian and results-oriented perspectives. Through its examination of the mismatch between what science knows and what business does regarding motivation, the book ultimately calls for realignment between organizational practices and human psychology, creating the potential for both greater effectiveness and more fulfilling experiences across work, education, and life contexts.